Long History's random UK Prime Minister of the Week. Number 47, Edward Heath. Stormy Waters. Hello everyone and welcome to the latest episode of Random UK Prime Minister of the Week by Long History. Every week we use our random number generator to pick a number between 1 and 57, and today we got the number 47, which means we're going to take a look at Edward Heath, and he was the Prime Minister between 1970 and 1974. This is now the 30th Prime Minister we've covered here on Random UK Prime Minister of the Week, so feel free to explore your podcast provider to find out more about Prime Ministers as wide-ranging as Spencer Perceval, the only Prime Minister to be assassinated, and Ramsay MacDonald, the first Labour Prime Minister. In each episode we ask the same series of questions, but they don't always quite fit. We ask what was the person like, how did they get into office, what were their main achievements, and why did they stop being Prime Minister. And along the way we like to give a bit of a flavour of the age, just to paint a picture of what was happening. Now if you like the sound of that, please don't forget to follow or subscribe to Long History. We've got plenty more of these weekly episodes to go. However, let's get going now with Random UK Prime Minister of the Week number 47, Edward Heath, Stormy Waters. What was Edward Heath like? Well, he stands out as being a bit of a character amongst the many characters who've become Prime Ministers. Striking, in particular, is how difficult it is to find positive descriptions of him. There are hints of friendships here and there, but it's most noticeable that he doesn't seem to have been a very likeable or a very liked person. Nor, however, does he appear to be the opposite of that, some sort of tyrant. He is particularly famous for what has been known as his decades-long sulk, particularly characterised in his poor relations with his successor as Conservative Party leader, Margaret Thatcher, whose perceived relative success can only have been galling for him. And the antipathy between the two seems to have been mutual. Edward Heath is one of the few Prime Ministers never to marry, and of course gossip filled the gap here. Some biographies claim that he was a gay man who completely suppressed his sexuality, swapping a sex life for politics. This does, however, seem slightly improbable, with other areas of his life, the enjoyment of music and the sailing, not suggesting a man trapped in a straitjacket. Others claim he was actually asexual and effectively sexless. And with this gap being filled by the gossip, there were even some very nasty and persistent rumours about child abuse, which have nevertheless never gained traction, and the accusations perhaps say more about the times themselves rather than they do about Heath. One biography in particular points out that Heath ended up finding all human relations impossible due to an oversensitiveness towards his own plight combined with an inability to empathise with anyone else. So bearing in mind his awkward relationship with humanity, how did this unlikable man get to become Prime Minister? Well, he was stubborn, but this can also be seen as being driven, and perhaps we've overstated his non-likeableness. You don't have to be a comedian to be a politician, and he does seem to have been very close to a small group of loyal supporters. He was perhaps unfashionably serious and reliable, two qualities which are admirable for a politician, at least on paper. He famously played the piano and enjoyed sailing, his most famous moment in this regard being when he and his crew won a Sydney to Hobart yacht race in 1969. It seems a bit of a strange move for an opposition leader, but the victory does seem to have led to good publicity for him. What was the historical background? Not many politicians were named in Beatles songs, but Edward Heath was one of them, being name-checked in George Harrison's song Taxman on the 1966 album Revolver. The line was, "Ha ha, Mr Heath," referring to the future Prime Minister. Edward Heath at that time had been leader of the Conservative Party since the year before 1965, with Harold Wilson also being mentioned in the same song, who was Prime Minister during those years. Heath was therefore the Conservative leader for quite a long time before he rose to the premiership, continuing to lead the Conservatives even after a March 1966 general election. The 1970s, in the meantime, were a slightly ugly time, and not just due to the strange, often brown and avocado green fashions at the time. British industry in particular seemed to run out of ideas in this period. Although Concorde had been a success in 1969, British industry, at least to itself, seemed to develop a reputation for poor quality, with the Austin Maxi, for example, exemplifying a car which gained a very poor reputation during the time. Deserved or not, I don't know. As well as this, the UK at the time was in the throes of the Irish issue, an issue which almost every Prime Minister in history has had to deal with. This was a particular hot point in the so-called Troubles, as they became known. What was happening in the US at the time? Well, Richard Nixon was the president during Heath's time in office, and although the UK and the US are often said to have a special relationship, things did seem to diverge for a time during these years. The UK, for example, stayed out of the Vietnam War, which was so central to the US at the time. Who could vote? Well, we always ask this same question, but there weren't many changes in the voting system after 1928 when women were given the vote. There was a tweak in 1969, when the voting age was lowered from 21 to 18, but with regards to democracy in general, Heath was particularly interesting in two ways. It's a strange quirk of the United Kingdom's voting system that the people don't actually choose the Prime Minister in a general election. They pick which party they want to rule, and that party chooses the Prime Minister. Now, generally this is of course very well known before the election takes place, but it often means that due to some scandal or controversy, one Prime Minister will resign halfway through a term and be replaced by another. This leads to the strange fact that Heath was the most recent Prime Minister to have been both voted into office by the general public and voted out of office by the general public in general elections. Even famous politicians such as Tony Blair and Margaret Thatcher were actually removed from office by their own political party rather than in general elections. Now, what often happens when a party loses a general election is that it will replace its leader. But Heath actually lost 3 general elections in total, and it was only after he lost his 3rd general election that Heath very reluctantly resigned and was replaced by Margaret Thatcher. What was Edward Heath's background? He was born in 1916 in Kent. That's the very southeastern part of England. His father was a carpenter who went on to run a successful business, and his mother was a maid. Heath was one of 2 children and was seen to be talented from a very early age. He was apparently a bit of a bookworm and played the piano, and seems to have been quite academic, succeeding in his education in a slightly swotty way. He went to grammar school and then went to Oxford University, where his academic success continued. He studied what is nowadays the standard degree for politicians, being philosophy, politics and economics. Now, Edward Heath came of age in the 1930s, and so his early life was of course dominated by the events on the continent, particularly in his early 20s, when he visited Germany and saw a Nazi rally at Nuremberg, coming very close to Hitler. He was called up to serve in the army in 1941 and served as an adjutant in the Normandy landings, earning an MBE in the process. After the war, he entered the civil service with a clear ambition to move ahead in politics. He resigned from that in 1947, trying other roles as he worked his way into politics, eventually winning his place in Parliament in February 1950. Winston Churchill made him a whip whilst the Conservatives were in opposition. These whips are the men who make sure that MPs vote in accordance with the party line, a job which required the ability to be both likeable and forceful, the former in particular not being a quality which has necessarily been associated with Heath. However, he seemed to take to the job very well, perhaps the discipline requisite in the job appealing to him because it reminded him of his time in the military. In the early 1960s, in Harold Macmillan's administration, Edward Heath was involved in the negotiations for the UK to join the early version of the EU. This particular move was vetoed by the French leader de Gaulle at the time, but it set Heath on a path towards what he viewed as his greatest achievement. When Sir Alec Douglas Hume took over from Macmillan as Prime Minister, Heath came to greater prominence, for example as the President of the Board of Trade. How did Heath become Prime Minister? The Conservatives lost the 1964 general election, with Douglas Hume being ousted from office and Harold Wilson entering as Prime Minister. Hume, as a result, resigned as the party leader, and Heath, who had risen to the post of Shadow Chancellor at that time, rather unpredictably won the role of leader of the opposition, becoming the youngest leader of the Conservative Party. As mentioned, he lost one general election, but when the next one came around in June 1970, there wasn't really any great expectation that he would win. However, again he surprised everyone. What were Heath's biggest achievements as Prime Minister? Even in the early days of Heath's leadership of the Conservatives when they were in opposition, he didn't seem to be a particularly popular figure, apparently being subject to constant criticism, leading to some of his more negative personality traits coming to the fore. He became more solitary and distrustful. He doesn't even appear to have been a popular choice for leader within his own party, not least when he lost that 1966 election. But the Conservatives decided they couldn't get rid of him as party leader so soon after selecting him. When he finally did become Prime Minister, almost as soon as he entered office, the Chancellor of the Exchequer he'd appointed suddenly died, somewhat derailing the administration before it even began. Generally, Heath's tenure comes across as a little directionless. Somewhat ironically for a sailor, he seems to have been pushed around by the tide of events. Unemployment rose steeply early on during his premiership, rising above 1 million for the first time in decades by January 1972, although it did fall back from that peak. Edward Heath was involved in the reformation of the boundaries of many counties, modernising an old system of local government. His administration is also notable for being when the UK's old pound, shillings and pence monetary system was swapped for the much simpler and much more boring, really, decimal system. Having fought in the war, Heath was particularly proud when his work led to the UK entering the EU, something which finally solved the UK's relationship with Europe once and for all. Yes, that was a joke, and all three of these attempts at modernisation have proved controversial over the years. Heath also made many plans to open up the economy, making first steps towards what Margaret Thatcher would eventually achieve. His time was blighted by strikes, however, leading famously to the 3-day week when electricity had to be rationed for a time. Thatcher would learn the lessons from this time during her own battles with the unions. Bloody Sunday took place whilst Heath was Prime Minister, as the Northern Irish issue continued to fester as it would for decades to come. Why did Edward Heath stop being Prime Minister? Rather than being a sudden and decisive end, as with many Prime Ministers, Heath's loss of power was complicated and somehow sputtering. The continuing strikes prompted Heath to call a general election in order to firm up his power. He used the slogan, "Who governs Britain?" as his call to action. The British public, however, gave an answer that was a satirist's dream. No party gained a majority, so the answer was, for a time, no one governs Britain. Heath tried to form a coalition with the Liberal Party, but when he failed, he was forced to resign as Prime Minister to allow the Labour Party, which although it had not gained an overall majority did have more seats than the Conservatives, to take over government. Heath at this point remained in charge of the Conservative Party, but there was a second general election in October of the same year in an attempt to clear up this rather messy situation. This second general election in a year did clear up the mess, but not as Heath would have liked it. Heath apparently wanted to cling on as the Conservative Party leader, but he was eventually replaced by Margaret Thatcher. This result was also not straightforward. It involved rule changes, and Thatcher's camp apparently deliberately downplaying the amount of support she had amongst MPs, to encourage a protest vote of sorts, suggesting that voting for Thatcher would act as a corrective to Heath, but there was no possibility that Thatcher would actually win. However, she did, and Heath began his famous sulk. Why should we remember Edward Heath? Some premierships are dominated by one or two signpost events. For Eden it was Suez, for example. For Lloyd George it was World War I, despite his other achievements. David Cameron would famously end the EU romance that Heath began. Many other prime ministers appear to have been caretakers, not seeming to do much in office really, one of these men being the aforementioned Archibald Primrose. Heath, in the meantime, seems to have had a lot to deal with during his time in office, but there was no single event that stands out, yet the list of what he had to deal with is remarkably long. There was Northern Ireland, and the strikes, and the surge in unemployment. He changed the UK's currency, and the boundaries of its local government. Issues that from an international perspective might appear to be minor, but for the historic counties and the new government areas that were created, these are still the subject of great discussion. Heath finally got the UK to join the EU or its iteration at the time, yet, for some reason, even allowing for Cameron's eventual Brexit mess, he doesn't seem to be able to take the credit for this. It doesn't stand out as part of his premiership, possibly because the referendum on the issue wouldn't take place until 1975, during Harold Wilson's second premiership. Rather, what stands out from Edward Heath's administration is this messiness, not least the messy end, when Heath tried to stand up for himself and received a fairly insulting shrug from the British public in response. His premiership seems to have suffered from that slight petulance and stubbornness of his, and whereas events are often blamed for the failure of prime ministers, see the episode on Harold Macmillan for the source of that phrase, Heath does appear to have been particularly swamped by them, and didn't have the popularity to sail smoothly through any of it, leading to that sense of an unpopular but experienced enough captain who nevertheless was on a stormy sea and not quite in control. Perhaps this makes him a candidate for one of those PMs who wasn't given a fair chance, but his decades-long sulk means that it's hard to put him anywhere near the top of a list such as that. Thank you for listening to this episode of Long History about a particularly interesting man and a very interesting and complex time in the UK's history. I hope you enjoyed that, and if you did, please do give it a like and share it with anyone who might be interested. Don't forget that this is just an attempt to summarise things. Hundreds of pages are written about these people, and this is just a 15 or 20 minute summary of what happened, which necessitates a number of shortcuts. However, we've given it our best attempt and I hope you enjoyed that. Thank you for listening everyone to Random UK Prime Minister of the Week. Number 47, Edward Heath. Stormy waters. Goodbye.